Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Laura Quirtner is our executive producer, and Anita Brockington, our engineer. Dr. Gay Bradshaw, founder and executive director of the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence in Jacksonville, Oregon, joins us this hour. Gay holds doctorate degrees in ecology and psychology. She has published, taught, and lectured widely in both these fields in the U.S. and internationally. She is the author of Pulitzer Prize-nominated Elephants on the Edge, What Animals Teach Us About Humanity, and Carnivore Minds, Who These Fearsome Beings Really Are, both published by Yale University Press. Dr. Bradshaw's work focuses on trans-species psychology, a field she founded, the theory and methods for the study and care of animal psychological well-being and multi-species cultures. Her research expertise includes the effects of violence on and trauma recovery for elephants, grizzly bears, chimpanzees, parrots, and other species, both free-living and in captivity. She joins us, as she has for the past 9 years when we met on air, and have since become sisters in care of the animal species of Earth, whose traumatic experiences at the hands of some humans we all can agree is a tragic consequence of worldwide dissociation as pathological reality. She joins us for a discussion of her recent books, Carnivore Minds and Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell. Hello, Sister Dr. Bradshaw.
Hi, Zoe. Nice to hear you again.
So nice for you to be here for us. Thank you. Your Carnivore Minds, which we did talk about one evening, Who These Fearsome Animals Really Are, a Yale Press 2017 release, talked about the carnivore predators, great white sharks, crocodiles, orcas, animals who eat other animals, grizzly or brown bears. Tell us a little bit about this and what your purpose was in writing Carnivore Minds.
After the elephant book came out, the whole topic of looking at non-human animals such as elephants and the species that you mentioned psychologically was really a new idea. It's been happening, of course, tacitly in the biomedical research that uses non-human animals, mice, chimpanzees, cats, dogs, rats, etc., in lieu of humans. So in other words, there's an implicit understanding that these other animals are like us, psychological. In other words, they have thinking, capacities for thinking and emotions and consciousness, etc. But the elephant, when that came out in terms of diagnosing PTSD, showing that wild animals and animals in general were vulnerable to psychological violence, it really sort of opened a kind of a new chapter. It wasn't so much that if animals are sentient or if animals feel, but rather putting them on the same plane as us. So when I wrote Carnivore Minds, which followed a few years later, my intent was to focus on a set of species, a set of animals that you mentioned, like white sharks and rattlesnakes and crocodiles, that are really vilified, and they're low on people's empathy list in terms of animals. So an elephant, for example, a lot of people feel a lot of empathy and connection and really admire elephants. But when it comes down to quote-unquote predators, like the puma, white shark, and crocodile, there's a kind of a cringe factor. So I purposely applied what I had done and developed it further in more depth and more specificity in the elephant book to these less appreciated and, as I said, vilified species. So the purpose of it was really twofold. First was to say, what we admire and what we can relate to in elephants more readily, it's the same thing for all of these other species. So it really was leveling this kind of species valorization hierarchy. The second reason is I really wanted to introduce concepts from mental health practices, from psychology, and later sort of contemplative practices that are used in terms of human trauma and human trauma recovery and understanding our fellow creatures to these the people that are studying animals in the wild, which are conservation biologists and ethologists and zoologists. So generally speaking, psychology is not included within their studies, and it's absolutely crucial, which is what the elephant diagnosis of PTSD showed, that if you don't consider that these individuals are psychological beings, then what happens is the kind of trauma and the symptoms associated with trauma. They're not objects. They're fully conscious, feeling beings that are vulnerable to violence like we are.
And as we've talked about before, when you actually understood that post-traumatic stress disorder was occurring in the elephant population, you began in South Africa almost 20 years ago when those bull elephants were killing rhinoceros, which, as you pointed out, was completely out of character for the species. And so you discovered and you really initiated this entire global scientific and psychological approach that their abnormal behavior was caused by their experience of human violence.
Yes, and I will interject here because it is many years later, right?
Yeah, 20 years later almost.
At the time when this, when I quote unquote discovered it, which was actually just putting the pieces of the puzzle together, and as I say it, then opening my mouth. There's a lot of reticence to acknowledge that non-human animals are comparable to us in the capacities that we used to say makes us unique. Because when you say that, then it basically says we need to not deny them what we have been denying and award them or not deny the rights that we cherish, meaning freedom and not being exploited and used in biomedical experiments, etc. So at the time, though, which was, like you said, almost 20 years ago, I can't believe it, that I was very conservative. I stuck really close to the science, which was very conventional. It's neuropsychology, the brain and the mind. The work that I did, putting the pieces together, has very deep roots in this whole corpus of neurosciences, psychology, and biomedical research. And so I stayed really close to the language, very, very strict language, for the purpose of really not leaving any loopholes, not making kind of inferences that would not be very easy to substantiate by conservative science. And at the time, one of the pieces of that, the reason I'm giving this preface, is that these young male bulls who had suffered a series of traumas from babies, they had, just to kind of give an overview for listeners who may not be familiar, is that when they were babies and they were infants, their families were slaughtered, typically by helicopter or gun-bearing helicopters. So they witnessed that. They lost their mothers. They lost their family. They were translocated. So all of these things are documented for humans and also in terms of animal models in the laboratory, dating back to Harry Harlow, who did terrible things to primates, non-human primates, showing that these are a series of trauma which mess up the brain and disallows any kind of normal regulation, all the symptoms of PTSD. And included within this, so the young elephants not only were killing rhinoceroses, but they were sexually assaulting. So at the time, that was a very important component. I don't want to say I played it down, but I didn't emphasize it because it has this kind of, sensational aspect to it, elephant raping rhino. And in fact, I was on this, co-interviewed with an ethologist from South Africa who, debated because the interviewer, like you, the host, was saying, well, weren't the rhinos raped by the elephants? And I went through the same explanation.
Right.
I didn't use that term on purpose because of its sensational association. And then the biologist, who's an ethologist, animal behavior person, said, well, it couldn't be called rape because there was no penetration. And I made the remark, which is true. I doubt that the rhino was really making a distinction at that point. But anyways, what's really important, and I see now, is that that's just bizarre and very upsetting that one species is sexually assaulting, sexually engaging another species in a belligerent way. I mean, it's not, kind of in this, a playful way. It's in a belligerent, which ended up in a fatality.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm underscoring that is because, as you mentioned, 15, 20 years later, is that really should stand out, and that really should bring some kind of very deep reflection.
And of course, we see that in the human population of children who suffer in war.
Yes. Yes.
or some kind of ecocide or whatever it is that displaces them, separates them from their families, where they witness death, where they witness violence. And of course, it plays out in a lifetime, oftentimes, of not just psychological damage and a deferred life, but a violent life where violence is easily meted out to somebody else or to dogs or to animals. And we see that in these white shooters who most of them or many of them have shared in, as children, the abuse of animals. So, it's abuse at any level has such a deep penetrating effect on soul and psyche. So your new book, though, is very different. It hasn't come out yet. It comes out in 2020, so we'll ask you to revisit us for an entire show just on that. But it's such a beautiful book, and I thank you so much for sending me some of the preliminary chapters. Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell. It'll be a Rocky Mountain Press 2020 release, and because you introduced me to Charlie before he, as I say, soared into the heaven realms, I had the privilege of interviewing him a few times and including his beautiful work in my own work on white spirit animals. So tell us about this book.
Well, that's Charlie and I met, quote unquote, shortly thereafter the publication of my book and his book, which was Grizzly Heart, published in 2009. And Charlie, we connected, and I forget, but we basically just clicked. And he lived in Canada, and he passed, it'll be 2 years, almost 2 years, year and a half ago. And he lived in Canada, just across the border from Glacier National Park in Waterton area. And I lived down here in Oregon. And we corresponded on the phone at least twice a week for 10 years. And we initially started because I've forgotten who connected us in some fashion. But he was very intrigued by my scientific credentials and what I was finding, even using a scientific lens, which from his experience really dismissed and discarded his own observations, not necessarily trauma, but in terms of the psychological depths and experiences and expressions of his work and time spent with largely grizzly bears and brown bears, which are the equivalent in Eurasia, Russia. As well as black bears. So Charlie was born and raised as a grandson of a pioneer in the most literal sense. The Russell Rigow, that's his mother's side of the family, is a legendary pioneer family in the region, and he was an extraordinary person. And he's extraordinary in his ordinariness.
Yeah, I think that's true.
We're used to, when we think about extraordinary people, there's sort of these extraordinary things like they climb to the top of Everest, or they have 5,000 degrees, or they discover something. And Charlie was extraordinary because he was just who he was and lived who he was with the bears as neighbors and friends.
So, the nice thing about your new book that's coming out, Talking with Bears, is just that. It's not talking about bears, but talking with bears. So explain to us a little bit more about this.
Well, let me take a step back since we started with the elephants. I realized this, it was in another interview that I had, that I realized subconsciously. It was not, it wasn't anything planned. But the arc, if you want to look at those three books, this kind of highlights the elephants on the edge, the carnivore minds, and then now this one, Talking with Bears with Charlie Russell. It's really been a shedding. I really entered into the investigation of animals as animals experience and what I experience with them with a scientific lens as a way to develop a collective language for translating what I had experienced personally. And that was kind of a mission of mine, and I, quote-unquote, accomplished that with the diagnosis and the study of the elephants and their experience. Carnivore Minds was an extension of that. But basically from all along the way, and finally in that book with Charlie, has been a shedding of this collective language, of this collective conceptualization. And in a sense, I really have used science, the neurosciences. I mean, it's a useful heuristic. I'm not denying that. But and this does lead into Charlie's book, as Niels Bohr used to point out, or the Buddhists say, pointing at the moon is not the moon.
Right.
Niels Bohr used to talk about it, the quantum physicist from Denmark, who was a colleague of Einstein's, and said that, the mathematics, the physics that we use to describe phenomena is not reality. He said it's just like a map of New York. You have a map of New York City, and it's very useful. It helps you get around. But the map is not reality. And so that's really been my intent. Like I said, it's unconscious. But the book, Talking with Bears, which is, like I said, Conversations with Charlie Russell, 10 years that we spent talking and discussing things, is really science-free in the sense of it comes down to really the personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that that's a very important principle that Charlie really conveyed. As Charlie was not Ph.D.s, I was useful because of that in terms of a collective validation, which reified what his personal experiences were. And you can see that in the Carnivore Minds book, is that the individuals, the chassis of Carnivore Minds, which is the neurosciences and neuropsychology of animal minds and human minds and behavior, it's really just an undergirding of the personal experiences of individuals who live very intimately with wild animals, whether they're white sharks or rattlesnakes. And their true gift, their true insights are because of who they are, not because of the science or the scholarship or the facts that they've gained. It's through their experience.
Exactly.
So the Talking with Bears book is really the embodiment of that philosophy. And I think Charlie would agree that the intent of this is to encourage individuals to use their own intuition, to cultivate their intuition and their insights and their abilities to perceive, like you do, Zoe, to understand, to use subjective experience as a very powerful tool for understanding how to live.
Beautifully stated. Well, look, we're going to take a little break, then we'll come back and we'll pick up some more because I liked, there was one bear, a brown bear, Brandy, who figures fairly largely in your book, and I'd like to talk about that. If you're just joining us, Dr. Gay Bradshaw is with us. She founded and operates the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence in Jacksonville, Oregon. You can find them online at www.kerulos.org. And, of course, all these links are at 21stcenturyradio.com, ZoharaOnline.com, and we archive our shows. They're posted weekly for free on iTunes and on our 21st Century Radio YouTube channel.
This is Kevin Schneider, Executive Director of the Non-Human Rights Project, the only civil rights organization in the United States working to establish fundamental rights for non-human animals. You can find out more about us at nonhumanrights.org, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Dr. Gay Bradshaw is with us. She is the founder and executive director of the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence in Jacksonville, Oregon. You can find them at www.kerulos.org. So before the break, Gay, we talked a little bit about Charlie Russell and the importance of talking with bears, not about bears. And there's a particular bear, a brown bear named Brandy, who figures largely in this book. Tell us about her relationship with Charlie.
Well, briefly, Charlie, while he spent the majority of his life in Canada, British Columbia, and Alberta, where he was born and raised, he spent 10 years or more, actually, in the far east of Russia, in Kamchatka. And he went there specifically to evaluate and assess and kind of investigate whether or not it was possible to live with brown bears, which again are the equivalent of the grizzly bears in North America, without violence. In other words, in a very kind of peaceful partnership. And North America has undergone tremendous kind of violence against the bears. relentless hunting, annual hunting and slaughter, so that actually today the grizzly bear habitat is just a fraction. I mean, we're talking a fraction of their original historical habitat before colonization. And so it was really his mission to demonstrate in a rigorous way that you can live very safely and easily in a beautiful way with these giant animals, these big predators. So he went there, and the book goes through the whole saga, and his book is wonderful too, Grizzly Heart. But when he was there, the first year he was there, he encountered this female brown bear, and they weigh between about 600 to 1,000 pounds, and they're quite massive and formidable and impressive. And as he says, she chose me, and she basically just started hanging out with him. And at one point, she decided, and this is his interpretation, she just left her cubs with him, and she went off. And that's extraordinary. There's the whole, the mythology is the most dangerous animal on the planet is a mother bear with her cubs. And here was this huge wild bear who really didn't know Charlie. I'd seen him for a while, not very long, maybe a few weeks. And she just left her cubs. And she went off, because there's a lot of business to do when you're raising kids, right? She has to run off males, she has to find food and things like that. So that really started this 10-year relationship where he became a nanny for her cubs. And she would go off for a few hours. And initially he describes how the cubs were distressed. They cried when she left. And his first response, which was totally intuitive. Now, he had lived with grizzly bears and brown bears, for years and years and years, very intimately. But he had never been in the position of being a bear. And he was really, Brandy basically asked him, or told him, as he said, he wasn't asked in any kind of way, you're going to look after my kids, and you better be responsible because I've got business to do. So she left that first time, and the kids were crying and bewildered, and Charlie intuitively fell on his back and kicked his arms and leg in the air, which is what a mother bear would do when they play with their children or when they nurse. Well, he obviously couldn't nurse. So essentially he became a nanny for 10 years, 3 sets of her cubs. And a year later, he actually rescued orphaned cubs from a zoo and reintroduced them in that same area in Kamchatka. And he became a real bear mother. And he did nannying and mothering for almost 10 years.
Yeah, I remember him talking about it on several occasions that we had an opportunity to speak to the issue. And, the beautiful thing, as you rightly characterize, is that Charlie Russell, as I said, he loved being bear, and he loved being with bear. And as I said, Charlie spent his life walking with bear, behind bear, next to bear. There's such beautiful photographs of his standing and fishing with the bear standing right next to him while they're fishing together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really hard for people to really see beyond the kind of extraordinariness of it, because again, for Charlie, and again, he wasn't just sort of casual about it. I mean, he was thrilled. He was in heaven. He was in heaven. But to really understand that they lived in a way that was beyond form. They really were living in a way that got down to the essence, to who we are and how we are. And that is really what this book is about. Charlie's books are absolutely marvelous, and I encourage any listener to pick them up and read them. They're absolutely fabulous. This book, and why we really started working together, was to, he didn't want this. He didn't want me to talk about him. I said, Charlie, right, in order for people to really understand how you see bears and how you understand bears and how bears understand you, because it's a reciprocal relationship, I have to talk about you, why and how you see bears the way you do. And so that's what this is. This is kind of Charlie Russell under the hood.
Right,
and
right.
Understanding what kind of philosophy he had, how he was raised, how he developed his ideas and his thoughts and perceptions and his ways of being.
And as we heard a little drop about the Non-Human Rights Project, which raises to the correct level, in my opinion, the equality of the human rights and animal rights that, and you mentioned it, animals have a right to autonomy, and they have family, and they have culture, and they have civilization. So, for people like us, when somebody says trophy hunting, I always say there's no such thing as trophy hunting. There's premeditated murder, and it should be prosecuted in that fashion. And I really believe that. And I remember his describing ways when he was a rancher and working with cattle that the bear would come to the edge of the property, and where normal cattle ranchers would shoot the bears, he instead would leave carnage that was around on the edge for the bears, and the bears would walk through the cattle fields, and normally the cattle wouldn't mind. Every once in a while they might poke their head up and go, huh, bear. And I've even interviewed people from indigenous communities in Native American societies who have talked about that there were times that they would just picnic next to sunning black bears in this country, and that it was quite common, that there was not this awesome fear that has been perpetrated by, the wildlife services and hunters and the NRA and all of those kind of, collusive, institutions who derive funding from killing.
And all of those ideas, to a large extent derive from European people who came to colonize.
Yeah.
And if you look back in Europe, all the wolves, all the bears, all the quote-unquote carnivores and predators. I don't like to use the word predator because we're all predators. A robin eating a worm is a predator.
That's what I would say. Ants are predators.
I say carnivore, and bears are not carnivores. They're actually largely vegan, with some salmon tossed in and maybe some once in a while a ground squirrel or some larva. But that all came from there, and they killed all of the wolves and the bears. Now there's being a kind of a restoration. So that's a really strong lesson in understanding the power of myth. That this cultural myth, and most people today, at least the ones I encounter, when they hear about Charlie, they're totally astounded. I mean, they have this amazing fear of a bear, and they've never even seen a bear.
Mm-hmm.
Same with, as you mentioned, in the wildlife agencies, which of course there's become this coercive element, which has to do with the fact of hunting and fishing provide revenues for the people who are supposed to be guarding the land.
Yeah. Pretty strange. So your last chapter, and I think it's worth talking about, deals with quantum physics, and Bohm's bear is what you call it, because this has a special place in 21st century radio, because I've interviewed so many wonderful scientists, artists, mystics, new paradigm thinkers, quantum physicists, who have really played a major role in my conversation over the last 30 plus years. So talk to us a bit about David Bohm and why you have this final chapter called Bohm's bear.
Well, I'll answer that, but you have to answer my question at the end.
Oh, all right. Well, you have to remember your question so I can answer it at the end.
Well, I'll tell you the story of it without giving it all away, because you don't read the end of a book. But when Charlie and I were working together, it's very interesting, because here am I come from a very different background, and we both came from very different backgrounds. I was schooled, he was not schooled, all these things. And we just really resonated. And the way I had approached it and the way he had approached me was very much like my past work, which was to looking at bears and human-bear relationships through the lens of neuropsychology and what we understand about the brain and mind and behavior. And that was okay. But it really didn't say, it was just a tiny, tiny piece of the picture. It did not include, why Charlie, as I said earlier, why Charlie saw what he saw, how he was able to do what he did. So we kind of reached an impasse, because we had set out to write a book together. And with the whole purpose of, for Charlie was to create a legacy beyond his own life. And we just got stuck. And so one night or day or whatever, I was kind of, scratching my head, and I came across, I went back to my roots, which is actually math and physics, I'm not like a fancy one, but I studied math and physics for many years. And I came across David Bohm. And David Bohm was a quantum physicist. He was the sort of the heir apparent of Albert Einstein. Most people know who Albert Einstein is. He was considered to be an absolute genius. And he was a younger generation, but he was of that very small circle of quantum pioneers. And he was an extraordinary man, and extraordinary in so many ways. I think for me, he was obviously brilliant in his physics, and what he had actually written about theoretically in physics was just recently reified by experimentation a couple of years ago, so that was pretty amazing. But the thing that really stood out is that he went on the streets. He continued to be a quantum physicist, and at the same time, his mission was to communicate to the public and to others what the implications of quantum physics was. And he maintained it's not just because it's fancier that we can make, faster computers or, fancier algorithms to secure funds for the banks and for military purposes. That's the same thing. That's reductionistic. That's dualistic. That's within the agenda of the capitalist system, of this very narrow, dualistic way of looking at the world. Quantum physics blew the doors off, and it basically says, in a sort of one way to put it, is we have a non-dual, life is non-dual.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is continuous. And
interconnected.
Everything is connected. Everything is.
Yes, exactly. The is. Exactly. Well, it's interesting because Dawson Church has just come out with a Hay House 2019 release entitled Mind to Matter, and has really just done, I think, the most extraordinary job of anybody I've ever read to do exactly this, to show how quantum physics enables us to talk about what the mystics have always understood, but used a different language to describe. And in the same way, in your book of Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell, you both have brought to, I think, the heart. Let's just talk about our heart for a moment. The brilliance of the light that endows all of life with coherence. And it's about entraining to coherence. And that, I think, is what Charlie accomplished.
Yeah, and as I said, Charlie was the embodiment of quantum physics theory of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Or I would say, let me correct, Charlie and the Bears as an entity, okay? Because we have to talk about it that way. We can't say Charlie and we can't say the Bears.
Right.
It's a relational framework.
Right.
And they are a fractal of this huge fractal of, like I said, what quantum physics really expresses as a theory of nature.
It's so beautiful. I can't wait for it to come out so we can spend an hour just on that. We have to take our last break of the hour. Dr. Gay Bradshaw is with us. She is an extraordinary, just a beautiful system of not only teaching and educating, but nonviolence is such a part of it. And if you go to their website, Kerulos, KERULOS.org, you'll see the many projects, including Being Sanctuary. And as Gay is often found saying in magazines, Psychology Today and elsewhere, why don't we become what the animals need us to be? Did I say that right? Is that how you say that?
It's be who animals need us to be.
All right, be who animals need us to be. On that, we'll be right back.
Hello, this is Jenny Brown, author of The Lucky Ones, My Passionate Fight for Farm Animals. You can learn more about me and my work as an animal activist and promoter of veganism at speakerjennybrown.com. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Remember that all of our guests, we have links to all of their institutions or their books at 21stcenturyradio.com and at zoharaonline.com. We also have archives, which are posted weekly for free on iTunes and on our 21st Century Radio YouTube channel. If you're just joining us, Dr. Gabe Bradshaw is with us. She is the founder and executive director of the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence in Jacksonville, Oregon. Their website is www.kerulos.org. So I almost hesitate to ask you this, but you are the most amazing writer that I know. Every book is groundbreaking. Are you working on a new book?
Well, I'm actually working on 3.
Oh, excuse me. What are your 3 new books?
Well, one of them is directed at, again, this is kind of like I said, as I feel personally as well as sort of externally, is that, that, again, as I mentioned, I started off kind of looking through the scientific lens and the experience of animals, and then dropping it, which is really, dropping this collective scaffolding to get down to our essence. And so this next really is a continuation of connecting the understanding that Charlie brought to the contemplative studies and
how beautiful.
Meditation and mindfulness, with the idea of now that just a caveat there is, that there's always kind of these funny, uncomfortable edges of animals and spiritualism, which oftentimes can be shortcuts. So using those terms, it really is sort of an individual progression. So the intent of this book is to again try to articulate in best ways as possible ways to bridge so that individuals can really feel free to, in a respectful way to really, like Charlie did, really, explore the depths with non-human animals and to really understand and transform in that process. So that's one, is to really connect. And I think that when we remove the sort of all these different lenses that have been passed down over time, generation after generation, we really understand and see the animals around us and trees. It's not just animals. And that's what science is even showing. It's sort of bit by bit, going down the ladder of Scala Natura. It's like, elephants have PTSD, they have a psyche. Now chimpanzees do, now parrots do, now trees do.
Right. Well, and I'd like
it's undoing all of these things. And so that's what the goal of this is to really encourage people to, through the medium of meditation and the contemplative studies and contemplative arts, to meet nature.
Well, and as you were pointing to, when we look at the mineral kingdom and then the plant kingdom and then the animal kingdom and then the human kingdom and then the angelic kingdom, they are all coherently integral. Yes. And I think oftentimes what has happened to humanity through the dialectic of dualism is that we look at these things as they're externalized and that there's a hierarchy of one above the other rather than the fact that they are all one, just having different experiences with different purpose.
Yes. Yes. And I refer that as seeing and living beyond form. Where we understand an elephant or a bear or, a rabbit or a snail.
Well, and people ask me as an animal telepath how I do what I do. And I always say, fundamentally it's about love. It's really respectful love that it's not, and anybody can learn to do this, and many people do with their dogs or their cats or their parrots or their ferrets or things that they love and live close to. And so I remind them, and children can do this because they don't question their imagination, that the image, we in our culture look at imagination as just this plaything. Oh, go play and have your imaginary friend, versus appreciating that being able to see and hold an image is really part of prophecy. That imagio is where imprint comes down into the receptors of brain, but mind is image, and it's through image with animal. And I say this to anybody listening audience who wants to know how to practice telepathy with their pet or a lost one, is to ask in your heart, if you have a dog named Junior who's missing, Junior, where are you? Junior, I love you. Really look at the first images that come to your mind and do not judge them. Don't try to qualify them, and don't dismiss them, because it's often that very first intuitive impression, like the way synchronicity happens. It's the same kind of arrival, that it's always there, but when we open ourselves up to it, we arrive with it simultaneously.
Yes. Yeah.
So one of the things I do want to ask you, because we'll talk about your other books another time, there's something you do that very few people do, is that at the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence, you offer programming on explicitly this whole issue of nonviolence, and that there is a way in which we can look at ourselves as a manager of ourselves in order to respect those that we care for or give sanctuary to. Speak to that a bit for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, our sanctuary, which we are expanding, so we have online learning, which is really wonderful, because I love online because it reaches and we connect with all sorts of individuals around the world. But we're expanding our sanctuary, so we have an on-site so people can actually meet together and work with the animals in recovery in a respectful and ethical way, and as a way to understand and explore what does it mean when we relate to human when we are living in a trans-species world, meaning that the rat, the rabbit, the dog, the elephant, the bear is part of our community much as another human is. What are our relationships as humans? So that's what we're really doing. Is it's so important to have embodied learning, embodied being, which is something we've forgotten and we've evolved away from. Again, obviously technology and things like that have been very useful, but at the same time, they have brought us into a reality which is not nature reality, which is not real reality. It's our own kind of isolated reality. So that's what we really try to do, is even though we focus on animals, our attention is at the human transformation, which again involves the contemplative studies and embodied learning.
You know, I want to share a very funny story, is that a number of years ago I had read about these tortoises that Fish and Wildlife, I think it was Arizona or so, were going to euthanize. They were closing wherever it was they were, and there were all these tortoises. And so I called Dr. Bradshaw and I said, Gay, have you heard about these tortoises? And she goes, yes, I'm adopting them.
Yeah. Well, it's been 5 years. They were going to, a research center had to close down, a government research center in Nevada. And I got asked to adopt. These were special needs. They lost an arm or a leg, and they range from approximately, they're estimated between 5 years and 80 years old. And there are residents, and this year is actually their 5th year here, and they're doing wonderfully.
How beautiful. And it's called, and I think it's important to add, it's called the Tortoise and the Hare Sanctuary, because you also rescue rabbits whom people have either abandoned or who have disabilities. Share with us a bit about the Tortoise and the Hare Sanctuary.
Well, it was one of these fortuitous titles that actually fit the circumstances because someone abandoned a house rabbit in our front yard, and we took the rabbit in, and we just loved her so much, and it was such a different universe, and we rescued more rabbits. And then this call came in from the tortoises. So we went, okay, again, as I call it, my mouth went faster than my brain. And
see, that's why I love you so much.
Oh, it's the Tortoise and the Hare Sanctuary. And subsequent to that, because of our reputation as trauma specialists and things like that, we've been asked to take in, for example, roosters from New York who were rescued from a ritualized slaughter, and chickens and a turkey, and so we were going to be the tortoise and the hare, but we're the tortoise and the hare in a very sort of synoptic way. Right.
So we're almost out of time, and you said you had a question for me?
Well, I just wanted to, you've become more familiar with Charlie and his work. How has it affected you?
Charlie basically affirmed the fact that a human in any situation with any animal has the God-given ability to commune in peace with that animal. His, for me, his endurance and his perseverance, even despite the most horrific things when the bears he loved so much had been murdered, that he continued on, made me feel like he was Braveheart. You know, that there's an element of courage. In prophecy, they say there's three things you need, which is courage, imagination, and this ability to persevere, a certain humility, a certain reverence, and Charlie embodied all of that. So to me, he's the prophet of the animals.
That's beautifully put. That's beautifully put, and it does capture Charlie's spirit.
So we have about 2 minutes left. What else would you like to share with us about the Kerulos Center for Nonviolence?
Well, I'm just really excited. I guess I feel like, you and I were talking about, we've been talking for almost 10 years, and it's been almost 20 years since the elephant, and
Yeah.
I know things right now are so grim, but I feel like at the same time it's this polarization of darker and lighter. And I'm just really excited about the programs that we're able to create and offer, because they provide tools for individuals to go out and create in the world. So I guess that's what I find exciting, is that, the work that we've done can actually be an offering for people to individually go out and create something new, something that we didn't even envision, that will really transform the way that our legacy has been over these hundreds of years.
I encourage everybody in our listening audience to go to the Kerulos website, because you will see that there are projects going on all over the world, as Dr. Bradshaw shared, and there are ways that everybody can be sanctuary, which is also like being within ourselves, a mindfulness and a compassionate heart for the suffering around us and the suffering we see. And
I don't know if I have 20 seconds more, but one of our programs is called Animal Allies. And I can't get into it now because of the time thing, but check that out. Someone contacted me who was working with prisoners in maximum security, and because of the elephant work, this individual created a book for other fathers. He was a father, and he's inside prison, how to father based on the elephants.
Wonderful. Go to www.kerulos.org. Blessings to you, Gay. Thank you so much for being with us on 21st Century Radio.
Stay connected and stay informed on the #1 news talk station, Talk Radio 680, WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.